What unfolds before you isn't just another dark chapter in human history. It's a living nightmare that continues to suffocate an entire nation under a blanket of systematized terror. The Taliban didn't merely capture Afghanistan, they transformed it into the world's largest open-air prison where justice became a weapon and public squares morphed into stages for unspeakable brutality. Right now, as you're watching this in February 2026, these atrocities aren't memories. They're daily reality. If you care about human dignity and want the raw, unfiltered truth about what's happening in Afghanistan, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Fleek of history doesn't sugarcoat reality. We expose it. Now let's uncover what the world keeps trying to ignore. From ruins rose monsters. Picture Afghanistan in 1994. A shattered nation drowning in its own blood. After Soviet forces withdrew, power-hungry warlords tore the country apart like vultures fighting over carrion. These armed factions battled viciously for cities, highways, and money while ordinary Afghans became collateral damage. Kidnapping, robbery, and cold-blooded murder became as common as breathing. Law had ceased to exist. Into this hellscape stepped the Taliban, emerging from Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. Most were barely adults, young fighters raised in refugee camps across the Pakistani border, their entire education consisting of narrow religious instruction in isolated madrasas. They marketed themselves with an intoxicating promise: absolute order enforced through rigid religious law. To a population traumatized by years of chaos, this pitch sounded almost appealing. Kandahar fell in 1994 nearly without resistance, but the Taliban's methods immediately exposed the horrifying truth beneath their promises. Any commander who hesitated to surrender faced swift execution. Territory after territory collapsed as stories of their savagery spread like wildfire. By September 26, 1996, they stormed into Kabul, a capital already gutted by years of bombardment and famine. The first lesson in terror. The Taliban's inaugural act in Kabul wasn't governance. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Dr. Mohammad Najibullah, Afghanistan's former president, had hidden inside a United Nations compound since 1992, convinced international protection made him untouchable. The Taliban shattered that delusion in the most brutal way imaginable. On September 26, 1996, Taliban soldiers burst into the UN compound, seizing Najibullah despite every international law and norm. What they did next traumatized even a nation hardened by decades of warfare. They tortured him mercilessly, including castration, before finally killing him. His brother Shahpur endured identical horrors, but the Taliban's message wasn't complete yet. They tied both corpses to a truck and dragged them through Kabul's devastated streets before stringing them up from a traffic light pole directly outside the presidential palace. In a final act of contempt, they crammed cigarettes and Afghan currency into Najibullah's mouth. The bodies dangled there for days, a grotesque billboard advertising the new regime's absolute power. This wasn't punishment for crimes. It was theater designed to inject paralyzing fear directly into the population's bloodstream. Constructing the fear machine. Within mere days, the Taliban erected a totalitarian apparatus that infiltrated every molecule of Afghan existence. They established so-called Islamic courts staffed exclusively with Taliban clerics, answerable to nobody but their commanders. These kangaroo courts operated without defense attorneys, without appeals processes, without even written statutes citizens could consult. Judges delivered verdicts in minutes. Executions followed within hours. Music vanished. Television went dark. Films disappeared. Photography became criminal. Virtually every form of artistic expression was obliterated. Weddings occurred in eerie silence. Radios were smashed in the streets. To even kite flying, Afghanistan's cherished cultural tradition, was outlawed. Every girls' school nationwide slammed shut, and women found themselves banned from employment. The burqa became mandatory female uniform, while men faced savage beatings for the crime of shaving. Taliban vice squads prowled every neighborhood armed with leather whips and wooden clubs, randomly stopping citizens to inspect beard length, clothing compliance, and behavioral orthodoxy. The slightest deviation triggered immediate physical violence. Fear wasn't just policy, it became the air Afghans breathed. The Stadium of Screams, Ghazi Stadium in Kabul, underwent a nightmarish transformation from athletic venue to Afghanistan's premier execution theater. The Taliban perfected a particularly sadistic bait and switch. They'd announce football matches, luring thousands of desperate spectators craving brief escape from their oppressive reality. What awaited them instead was forced participation as witnesses to systematic mutilation and murder. Survivors described scenes that defy comprehension. Men accused of theft, most never receiving anything resembling fair trials, were dragged to the stadium's center. Medical professionals attended these spectacles not to heal, but to guarantee correct amputation procedures. Limbs were hacked off while thousands sat in mandatory silence, blood pooling on grass where Afghan children once kicked footballs. Milweiss, who'd already lost his leg to a landmine, found himself falsely accused of theft. The Taliban hauled him to Ghazi Stadium and severed his arm before a massive crowd. He later testified, "If the Taliban soldier had been standing next to me, I would have grabbed his weapon and killed him, or killed myself. That would have been better than what has happened to me." Amputations frequently preceded executions. Afterward, incredibly, the stadium would host actual sporting events, as though nothing had transpired. This psychological terrorism achieved its goal. No space remained sacred, no moment safe. Women, primary targets. Women bore the heaviest burden under Taliban rule, punished for actions that aren't crimes in any civilized society. A woman could face adultery charges simply for conversing with an unrelated male or stepping outside without male escort. Trials were theatrical jokes with predetermined outcomes. In 1999, Ghazi Stadium hosted one of the most disturbing documented executions. A woman accused of adultery was forced to kneel before thousands, entirely concealed beneath her burqa. A Taliban executioner pressed a rifle to her head and fired as the crowd watched in frozen horror. The killing was filmed and distributed globally, sparking international outrage the Taliban completely dismissed. Stoning became the Taliban's preferred method for terrorizing women. In 2015, 19-year-old Rokhshana from Ghor province tried fleeing a forced marriage with her fiancé Mohammed Gul. Captured by the Taliban, they conducted an instant trial. Rokhshana was buried chest deep while men hurled rocks at her until death. Gul received flogging but survived, revealing the consistent pattern where women died for alleged offenses that earned men lesser punishments. A cell phone video captured Rokhshana's final moments, her agonized screams as stones smashed into her body repeatedly. Villagers recorded the murder on their phones, documenting atrocity while utterly powerless to intervene. The psychological devastation rippled outward. Children absorbed these traumatic images permanently. The insurgency years. When U.S.-led military forces overthrew the Taliban government in late 2001, Ghazi Stadium executions halted suddenly. Countless Afghans dared hope Taliban terror had ended forever. That optimism proved catastrophically premature. The Taliban didn't evaporate. They melted into mountains, rural strongholds, and Pakistani sanctuaries, waging a relentless 20-year insurgency. Their brutality continued full force in territories they controlled, just less visible to international observers. They operated shadow courts from mosques and private residences, dispensing identical merciless judgments without documentation, legal representation, or credible evidence. Anyone accused of government collaboration, foreign support, teaching, or aid work vanished during midnight raids. Most were never recovered. When bodies eventually appeared on roadsides, families remained too terrified to demand answers. In 2010, the Taliban publicly stoned a young couple in Kunduz province whose crime was attempting to elope rather than accept forced marriages. Villagers faced compulsion to attend and participate. The woman died. The man survived but sustained severe injuries. This wasn't an anomaly. It was calculated messaging that Taliban ideology remained unchanged. I know Amnesty International documented Taliban collective punishment campaigns in Panjshir province, where they tortured civilians to death, including farmers granted official permission for mountain grazing. Mass arbitrary detention, systematic torture, extrajudicial killings, and property annihilation became routine. Terror restored. August 15, 2021. International forces completed withdrawal, and the Taliban flooded back into Kabul. The Afghan government disintegrated instantly. Taliban spokesmen appeared on television pledging amnesty for soldiers, police, judges, and officials. Pure fabrication. House-to-house manhunts began immediately. Taliban fighters systematically hunted anyone connected to the previous government. Former soldiers evaporated. Young men disappeared during questioning sessions. Investigative journalism by 5 media outlets exposed that despite proclaimed general amnesty, the Taliban systematically executed at least 110 former Afghan soldiers. Throughout 2022, the Taliban meticulously rebuilt their 1990s terror infrastructure. Courts, prisons, and religious police units were reestablished. A reconstituted Supreme Court, staffed entirely by loyalist male clerics, rejected every modern legal standard. No defense counsel. Evidence based on accusations or coerced confessions. Trials lasting minutes. November 2022. The Supreme Court announced mass public punishment in Takhar province. 19 people, including 9 women, were publicly whipped 39 times each. Alleged crimes: adultery, fleeing home, unauthorized relationships. Executions resume. December 2022 marked the watershed. The Taliban's first publicly acknowledged execution since recapturing power. In Farah province, Tajmir, convicted of murder 5 years earlier, faced hundreds of spectators and senior Taliban officials. The victim's father fired 3 assault rifle rounds into Tajmir after Supreme Leader Mullah Hibatullah Akhundzada personally authorized the execution. The United Nations condemned this, warning Afghanistan was rapidly reverting to practices that horrified the world previously. The Taliban completely ignored international pressure. February 2024, Syed Jamaluddin and Gul Khan were publicly executed with multiple gunshots in a Ghazni city football stadium. Supreme Court official Atikullah Darwish read Akhundzada signed death warrants before thousands. Victims' families attended and declined to offer mercy. By 2025, the scale became staggering. UN human rights experts reported that in just the first 4 months of 2025, at least 213 people, 169 males and 44 females, were publicly flogged. In April 2025 alone, 4 men were publicly executed in one day across 3 provinces. Today's reality: as of February 2026, this nightmare accelerates. In 2025, the Taliban executed at least 6 people publicly, the most recent in Khost province in December. Since August 2021, at least 12 confirmed public executions across multiple provinces. Taliban courts have issued horrifying statistics: 175 execution sentences, 37 stoning sentences, hundreds more floggings. Between March 2022 and March 2024, 298 people were publicly whipped. In 2025 alone, 587 individuals, including 106 women, were flogged for alleged offenses like fleeing home, immoral relations, and theft. June 2025, UN Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett concluded Afghanistan faces a deep human rights crisis as the Taliban systematically dismantles legal frameworks. Bennett stated the Taliban is instrumentalizing legal and justice sectors to entrench institutionalized gender oppression, constituting crimes against humanity. January 2026. Georgetown University reported that Taliban's new criminal regulation effectively legalizes slavery, violence, and repression against women. By embedding vague moral offenses and extreme penalties into law, systematic repression became legal policy. The psychological devastation extends infinitely beyond direct victims. Children wake screaming from nightmares. Parents warn sons into silence and daughters into invisibility. Fear permeates every conversation, every glance, every moment of daily Afghan existence. Women emerge only when absolutely necessary, fully covered. Families constantly warn each other to remain invisible because visibility invites death. This isn't history, it's happening now to real human beings. If this video shook you awake to Afghanistan's ongoing crisis, you must act. Subscribe to Fleek of History. We refuse to let these stories die in silence. Smash that like button to force this into more feeds. Share it aggressively. Drop your thoughts in the comments. The Afghan people suffering under Taliban rule can't look away from their nightmare. We have no right to look away either. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next expose.